Have you ever wondered what the term transgender means? Do you find the conversation around the transgender experience confusing? What's the difference between sexual orientation, that is being gay, lesbian, or bisexual, versus gender identity? Today's show will answer these questions and explore related issues. Featured on today's show is Matthew Francis, a transgender man who has a most remarkable and inspiring real-life story. Matthew will be the ongoing host of this Diversity Dignified series. In the fourth decade of his life, Matthew grew to be the person he was always intended to be. His story is one of fortitude and resilience about what it takes to capture a genuine identity. While his journey can be seen as the unfolding of a gender identity that had been buried and then resurrected, it is about much more than that. We all, regardless of the gender identity we experience, struggle to be who we are in all sorts of ways every day. Those whose biologic sex aligns with their inner sense of gender identity, that is, being male or female, biologically, emotionally, psychologically, and socially, are called cisgender. Cisgender people have great privilege and can take a lot for granted because of their identities, are readily accepted, and they benefit from this alignment with societal expectations. A transgender person contends with enormous challenges and must overcome hurdles that others never have to face. This is not because having a different gender identity from birth sex is an inherent problem, but it is because we live in a world that assumes binary gender identity. That is, either male or female, with all of the expectations and assumptions about what it means for people who claim one of these identities. There are arguments on the other side of this that question whether being transgender is an inherent risk factor for poor mental health and life functioning, but research has shown that this is not the case, especially when a transgender person receives emotional support and their identity is affirmed by parents, peers, and others in their broader social worlds. What we know is that gender identity is far more fluid than we have been socialized to believe. Because of this, a person with a non-conforming gender identity, transgender or not, can easily be labeled in stigmatizing ways, in ways that can be significantly detrimental to well-being, emotional, social, spiritual, and psychological health. When a person's internal experience of self and gender expression is incongruent with the expectations of the external world, there is tremendous stress, and this sets the stage for various forms of suffering. Depression, anxiety, or substance abuse due to isolation, discrimination, rejection, or even abuse and violence. When one's sense of being is threatened to this extent, the damage to that person is profound. As a society, we believe that there are only two gender experiences, and anyone who does not fall into this binary view is seen as pathological. Mental health professionals themselves, educated in this paradigm, then pathologize people whose gender presentation does not reflect binary gender. They then apply labels that stigmatize, and this is a setup for poor development and life difficulty. Trans people are healthy when offered the support and acceptance everyone needs to grow. They are just as innately capable of loving relationships, meaningful participation, and being fully contributing members of society. Under these circumstances, a trans person will flourish, as would anyone. In Diversity Dignified, you will learn not only about Matthew's journey, but about how his experience can inspire others facing similar challenges.
Hello, and welcome to Diversity Dignified. For the next hour, we're going to talk about issues and concerns that face the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community, or the LGBT community. We hope to inspire, we hope to educate, inform, and hopefully question things that are going on in our world today that face this community. This series will be hosted by Matthew Francis, and we think the best way to start this off is to ask Matthew questions about the show ahead. Welcome.
Thank you.
Matthew.
Yes.
Why this, why now?
I feel that in 2015, when Caitlyn Jenner came out, there's a tremendous amount of awareness, but that has not translated into acceptance. It's an emergency in my mind, Michael. There is, every year, transgender violence, it keeps increasing. Our awareness has made people simply more visible, and we want to normalize the situation to make it safe and make it inclusive. And so why now? Because it's an emergency right now.
And what do you hope to accomplish by presenting this series on the LGBT community?
Precisely what you said in your introduction. I really want to educate and inspire and normalize the situation. I want to introduce topics that are pertinent to the LGBT community. I want to introduce ordinary folks just to see that we're your friends, your neighbors, and your families, and that there's really nothing to be afraid of. That we're here, that we've always been here. And now that there's this awareness, then let people just see who we are. Just that we're ordinary people. We want the same things. We feel the same feelings. And I think if people, the more we tell our stories, the more that we get to know each other, I think it's really hard to hate someone or want to hurt someone once you know who they are.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the misinformation out there.
Sure.
How widespread is that?
I think, unfortunately, it's very widespread because we don't have enough narratives right now going on. And so what we have is a lot of stereotypes, a lot of preconceived ideas about what being trans is and isn't. The dominant stereotype right now really is transgender women and bathroom issues. And it's not about homelessness or that we're being hurt or that a lot of us are doing okay if we get the same love and kindness and acceptance as anyone else. We thrive, we flourish the same as everyone. And so I think that's really my purpose, and I think the misunderstandings is that we're highlighting bathrooms, so we're not talking about other things that are far more important.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the LGB part of this.
Sure.
What do you think is happening in that community? What issues do you hope to address? And what misinformation are we getting out there?
The LGBT part of the spectrum, in theory, is doing better since equality was achieved. And that shows that when society embraces, people thrive. And so just that alone, highlighting that and showing how well people are doing now that society has been more accepting, I think is a great example to show that if we can do the same thing for the T part of this, that the same thing can happen for us.
Mm-hmm. During the course of the series, we're going to find out a lot more about you.
Sure.
What do you hope to bring to the series based on your own personal journey?
In some ways, my journey as a transgender person is not extraordinary. I have trauma background, and I struggle with mental health issues, and unfortunately trans folks do because of this not acceptance. And then once I was able to come to terms with who I am, I was able to thrive, and that is what I've seen in other people as well. When they have been able to come to terms with who they are, that energy that you exert trying to create this persona, you can use this energy instead to do creative pursuits instead of just being defending yourself all the time or not being who you are. So I'm forgetting, go back to that question.
Well, what do you think are the top 3 issues that are happening within the LGBT community today?
I think the top issues for me are the violence that's happening, the rejection that's happening, homelessness. Those things we need to be looking at those things.
On the flip side of that, what do you think are the 3 top things that our straight community has misconceived about the LGBT community?
Do you want to chime in on this?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of kind of othering going on. And I want to go back to something that Matthew said a few minutes ago about how when you get to know people as real people and understanding that there's so much common ground between us that it sort of breaks those barriers down. But so I think your question was about the heterosexual community and or the cisgender community and
then within the LGBT community and what the issues are, their top 3 issues are.
Yeah, okay, well I also would add that discrimination I think is rampant, and that is both explicit discrimination and implicit discrimination, kind of institutionalized discrimination, things that people just do without even thinking about it. That's discriminatory against LGBT and T people. On a regular basis, and the profound impact. And I'm also concerned about legal rights of LGBT people. Now, while marriage in some places is a right, in other places it's challenged on a regular basis. There are many other issues that are legal issues that are involved that I think need immediate attention.
Over the course of this series, we'll have a lot of guests on here talking about different subject matter. For the person who's watching right now and debating whether or not to change the channel, and who may be struggling with some of the issues that we are going to talk about, what would you say to them?
I'd say keep watching. We're going to be addressing issues of trauma, addressing issues of addiction, aging, every issue that affects our population affects everyone. And this othering you're talking about, we're going to talk about scapegoating even. Why do we need to do this at all? Why can't we all just, even if we don't like another person, so to speak, why can't we be safe with them? Why can't we be inclusive? So we're going to challenge some of that. I'm also going to look at maybe some of the cultural things going on in the transgender community that people are curious about and want to ask more about, and let's highlight some of those things.
And for the straight community that's watching, why should they continue?
Because we're just fascinating people.
And I think even just to add to that, I think we're kind of at a pivotal point, and with the way that we've had this sort of bifurcated political situation,
very polarized.
And I think that it's important for people to start listening to others and to begin to understand other people that they perhaps wouldn't ordinarily come in contact with. And this is an opportunity for that, staying tuned to this show and opening your mind and just listening, even if you disagree or you have some concern about what it is that's being discussed.
I would add, piggyback off that, is if you're uncomfortable, go ahead and stick with that a little bit. That being uncomfortable is you're not going to spontaneously combust, and let's just go ahead and push through that together, and get there. We're going to get there.
Great. I think it's a good time to go out onto the streets and find out what people are thinking. And that's exactly what we did. We went out with our cameras and we asked the following question to people. What fears do you have for members of the LGBT community in today's current political climate?
Trump is kind of scary with that. At the same time, the president doesn't always have like the power to make like radical changes. So I'm not too worried about it. I feel like being transgender is a little comes with more challenges than being like bi or gay, because it's just kind of like a newer thing that people are like, okay, we're more used to gays and lesbians, more tolerant of that, but now it's like a new thing that maybe people will be less tolerant of.
I think perhaps the group you asked about in the first question would fare better because more people are more familiar and for a longer time with their issues than with the transgender. Yes, because I think it's a really hard question to resolve in those people's minds. Yes.
Not a good time with that neo-Nazi fascist in Washington. Did I say that out loud? Not good. Yeah, not a good time for the LGBT community, man. Not at all. Because he's such a paranoid guy, and his people are ultra right wing, and it's we're gonna have to push back. I'm ahead, but I support the Rainbow Coalition. I support gays and transgender, and the whole thing. It's a matter of human rights. Smallest subset, and it's finding. And it's been very controversial, and there's getting a lot of pushback on the bathroom situation, the legislation, and all that stuff, especially from all the rednecks south of the Mason-Dixon line and all that. Did I say that out loud? Many transgender friends, including going way back 20 years ago. There's a gentleman I used to work with, Gary Hannaford, became Gwen Hannaford from Kittery, and that's doing that in the military-industrial complex. That was really turbulent. It's like 20, 25 years ago. It's like. I was one of the few people that didn't matter to me. I don't care, it's your thing, man. You were my friend before, you'll be my friend after, and now and forevermore, My friendship's not conditional, whatever,
Yeah, I agree.
It's none of my business what your thing is, you know what I mean?
So, Matthew, first impression.
I'm really impressed really with the humanity in the responses. Clearly people are concerned and want to help, and they want to understand, and this is what this show is going to do. It's going to humanize and help people to understand.
Jeanette.
Yeah, I was really struck by the articulation of the human rights concerns. This is about human rights, and it's about social justice. And I was really struck that, you know, the random person that was interviewed on the street had that perspective. Yeah.
Your thoughts about what the gentleman said about the transgender part of our LGBT community having it harder than everyone else. Talk about that.
I think I agree with that. It's not that this is a new phenomena, but the awareness is new. And so information is traveling at the speed of light, but people have not heard of this before. And so their hearts and minds take some time to adjust to it. But, you know, transgender people have always been among you, and we're here, and we want our rightful place. So.
How long has the transgender community been here?
Since the beginning of time. We were also maybe familiar with the term Two-Spirit. That is a Native American term. We were once a revered people, and we were looked upon as the sages and the teachers and the educators. In fact, if I would have been born in that time, it would have been known. We've lost touch with our spirituality, our history, and we would have been raised differently, and we would have been looked upon as leaders and not caricatures as the way we have been. And I think that's really important. We've been dehumanized, and we're wanting to elevate our humanity back with everybody. We are here, and we have a place, and it's a good place.
Jeanette, the woman was saying that we don't understand or hear as much about the transgender as we do about the gay and the lesbian and the bisexual community. Talk about that.
I think that that's kind of a tough question to respond to. I think that there's been perhaps a little bit more visibility in the LGBT community, and the trans community is acquiring more visibility. So I think that maybe for an average person who hasn't been or doesn't know anybody who's been in that world, that they feel that there hasn't been as much talk about the transgender community. But even though that it has not been the case, I mean, really, since I would say, as an academic, since the mid-90s, when the term cisgender became sort of common language, became used more commonly, that there has been attention in some circles. I think also with the internet and social media, there's been opportunity for a lot more visibility. Yeah.
Our last gentleman spoke about it not being a good time for our LGBT community because of our political climate. Matthew, talk about that. Do you agree, disagree?
Oh, I absolutely agree. Our violence has escalated the last 3 years, and it not being a good time, the fact that we're sitting here debating my rights, I don't know that it can be any more in the forefront. I don't understand that even has to be an issue. I understand that I would want to woo you into understanding my condition or whatever you want to look at it, but debating my rights, that to me is just unconscionable.
But on the flip side of that, we are debating your rights, which we would not have done not too many years ago.
Right.
So in a sense, do you think that we are able to speak about all of this? Isn't that a positive step in our political community at the moment?
To me, it would be positive if we were speaking about this in terms of relevance and understanding, but the fact that I have to fight to secure rights that the average person just takes for granted, to me, it says no, we're not where we need to be at all. Is this a step above? I don't know. I mean, it's hard for me to say that when I'm hearing about our violence increasing. So,
Jeanette, you made a good point about we sort of what people know about the LGBT community is from what they read, see, hear in social media, on the news, and what we put out there for them. On the flip side of that, do you feel that if it doesn't affect somebody, if it's out of sight, out of mind, that it doesn't matter to them? Would you agree with that?
I think that that's in part human nature. Like, people aren't exposed. They are not going to be as in touch with what the issues are, and it's not going to matter to them as much. When it gets personal, I think that's where change can really happen. And I think in this current, while I agree with you completely, you know, with the rise in violence, that is a grave concern, what's going on right now. What I also see happening, though, is that there is more kind of coalescing around important social justice issues right now, because we're being kind of forced to look at things in a different way, and to protect human rights in a different way. So I think it's kind of both of those things.
It's a double-edged sword, really. Yes.
Well, it's very, very scary time. At the same time, people are also wanting to come together and fight for human rights.
Is there a certain demographic in our community on a whole that we need to make more aware of what's going on? Do you feel that we need to be focusing more on our youth, more on the senior population, or more in that middle area of our population?
Specifically for the trans, I think youth are highlighted, and I think that's good. We need to protect the youth. And I mean, Title IX repealed rights that really were impacting youth the most. But what I am also equally aware of is that, you know, this isn't a youth movement. There are a lot of people in various ages that are struggling, or are even scared in some ways about this awareness, because it maybe is going to bring them out, and they're not ready for that. So we need to be being aware of everybody. And you know, I am from Maine, and Maine is the oldest state in the country. So there's an aging population, LGBT in general, who's really scared what's going to happen to them, you know, in terms of medical care, in terms of what kind of nursing homes they're going to need. They don't, you know, trans in particular, we don't want to be put up on display as some kind of freak show. And so I think focusing on, you know, different people feel called to focus on different things, and I feel called to focus on more the adult, older population.
All the issues that our community is facing are also the same issues that the heterosexual community is facing. So why are we even having this discussion? Why shouldn't it be universal instead of separated?
Can I answer that?
Sure.
I just wanted to say it's because of privilege. You know, there is you know, heterosexual privilege, and there's a lot that when you're a heterosexual person in this world, that you don't have to worry about. You don't have to worry about your safety in the same way just because of your heterosexual identity. You don't have to worry about your legal rights in the same way that that you do if you're gay, lesbian, bi, or trans. I mean, there are so many issues, but I think it comes down to privilege that I think is a major issue.
And I think if we go back out on the street at some point, one of the questions that we can put out there is, do we feel that the gay community, the LGBT community, do they have privilege? And we'll find out in a future episode. Right now, I think it'd be a good time for us to switch chairs.
Okay.
And let you meet your audience.
Sounds good.
And I'll sit there and we'll continue our discussion.
Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in. Jeanette and Michael, thank you for such a beautiful introduction to this very important work that we're doing. And I will be taking over as the host. I would like to discuss some very disturbing statistics that impact our LGBT community. And we'll have some thoughts about that and go from there. Our violence, as you know, is really up. 72% of trans folks experience violence, and of that 72%, 67% are transgender women of color. What do you think about when you hear that?
It's shocking. I would have thought it would have been leaning heavily on the trans male side.
Okay.
So I'm not sure how to explain that. Perhaps you can shed some light on why that is.
Well, my personal explanation is that there's the dual issue of racism, and transgender women often don't pass as easily as transgender men, and I think it makes them more visible. They're also at higher risk because of that discrimination to be in jobs that put them more at risk. What do you think about that, Jeanette?
Well, I think violence against women in general
Absolutely.
is very high.
Absolutely.
And women are more vulnerable. And adding to that, as you said, you know, women of color are particularly vulnerable.
Yep.
And to be targeted.
Yes.
I think, can you explain something to me?
Sure.
Explain to me transgender. I mean, I have friends still who think of transgender as men who dress up in women's clothes.
Oh, I see what you
or
mean.
women who put on leather and ride motorcycles.
Right.
So what is transgender?
Transgender really is an umbrella term for folks who don't fall easily into the role of male or female. So, for example, I was born female, and I knew internally that wasn't so. So, you know, my presentation is male. I'm male, and so it's for a person whose presentation or feels not in alignment with their assigned gender at birth. Mm-hmm. So it's an umbrella term too, because it also does mean, it can mean people who are just don't identify as a different gender, but their presentation is different. The way they express themselves falls under that umbrella term.
So it's not just an outward appearance, it's an inward.
It's an internal incongruence. So if Jeanette was born female, she was assigned female at birth, and she feels good about that, then she's cisgendered. If she didn't feel that that fit for her, if she felt male, or some folks are fluid, and that falls under the category of transgender.
I just want to say something about, there's actually kind of a spectrum of
Yes.
gender identification, right? So on one end there's sort of extreme maleness, on the other end there's extreme femaleness, and there's everything
In between.
And that can, and if we all think of ourselves and our own kind of gender identity, my identity would fall closer to the end of female, but I also have characteristics that might be more kind of in the middle,
Sure.
or more, so that I think it's a useful way of thinking about gender as a spectrum of identification with male, you know, the traits that are associated with maleness versus the traits that are associated with femaleness.
Yes.
And an inner experience.
Yes.
Yeah.
So is the violence coming out of the fact that someone's saying, oh, that is a man trying to be a woman, or a woman trying to be a man, so let's be violent? Is that where it's coming from?
I'm not entirely sure. I think, you know, transgender issues are bringing up it's hard for people because this is how you see yourself, it's how you define yourself, and we're challenging those norms. So fear tends to breed violence, and so if you're being challenged and you have those propensities, then
Right.
someone's going to be targeted. And so for other statistics that we'll be discussing, trans folks of color are 6 times more likely to experience police violence. That's true for folks of color in general, that they are, as we know, they're being highlighted as well as being targeted with police violence, and transgender folks of color 6 times more likely to have problems with police interactions. So, what do you think that might stem from?
That's a really stunning statistic. I think of all the, again, I get back to that, the notion of othering.
Yes.
And we think about all of the, you know, the recent, what we've seen also a lot of is black male, police violence against black males,
Yes.
who are also in that kind of other category,
Yes.
and can be targeted. So I think, again, it's about that sort of othering and the misunderstanding and the kinds of challenges that people experiencing internally when they don't understand.
It brings up fear, and I guess I get back to that point where we don't like being uncomfortable, and we don't know how to react. We don't know how to just sit with some of that discomfort. And so to me, it's almost just this really primitive reaction, and that we need to get beyond just having a reaction. We need to have a thoughtful approach So you can be afraid, doesn't mean you have to act on it.
So is the violence from the police, is it because they're saying, oh, look at that person of color trying to pretend that he or she is this gender? Or is it more truly a racial issue and not necessarily a gender issue?
I would think it's a combination, that it's just so multifaceted and deeply ingrained, you know, and that's what we're trying to peel away, get those layers, highlight it. So we can't talk about it if we don't know about it. Now we know about it, we're highlighting it, and then talking about it, humanizing people of color, humanizing transgender people, and in hopes that it will decrease the violence. And another disturbing statistic is that 1.7% of trans men experience sexual abuse as compared to cisgendered men. It's elevated. So that obviously is a huge issue as well. And we have a lot of other statistics that we're going to go through with suicide, in regards to suicide with our community. The transgender community has an alarming rate of suicide. It's at a rate of 87%, which is absolutely unconscionable. And transgender men have a significantly higher rate. I believe that rate is 7% higher than transgender women. And I remember, Jeanette, you were highlighting that men in general have an elevated rate. So would you mind talking about that a little bit?
About suicide rate, yeah. Well, when you think about the issues, I think when we opened up this the show today, and I was talking about the incongruence between the person and the worlds in which they live. And how that sets people up to develop other sorts of forms of suffering, such as depression or anxiety or substance abuse problems, which in turn places people at high risk for suicide. Social alienation, rejection, isolation, you know, the disconnection from others really places people at high risk in the trans population because of the continued social stigma and misunderstanding. Certainly would be then at higher risk of suicide.
And I think trans people, LGBT community in general, when it comes to the suicide rate and the rejection you're talking about, we have a special concern, because if you stop and think about it, if you're a person of color, your family isn't going to reject you from being a person of color. But the LGBT community gets rejected by their own families for being who they are, because they're not fitting into that heteronormative paradigm. And I think that's an additional burden, because we don't have the same community maybe as maybe another you know, like a Muslim population or a person of color. There's a community or a sense of family that we're lacking, that we don't have. That's why we need this forum. So.
And that's why I think it is really pressing now to be talking about this, and so that people understand, and that kind of alienation, just by virtue of being a trans person, is really unnecessary, completely unnecessary, and it leads to tremendous problems in people's lives that don't have to happen.
That's right. So one of the things we know is 68% of LGBT folks are rejected by their families, which really sets them up for homelessness and a host of other issues. A fifth of trans folks experience homelessness. 90% of them experience job discrimination, and in many states it's still legal to discriminate against trans people. So when you don't have your family support and you're being pushed out, you are at risk for a host of problems, for real predators out there. If you don't have family support, I don't even know where to begin, what a disadvantage you're at. And I may be putting myself on the limb. I really think families are intending to do the right thing. I think they think if I push my child out, if I reject my family member, they're going to come around and do the right thing and reject their identity to fit in. And I think it comes from a well-meaning place, but it's misguided, and it's hurting people, it's killing people. So what are your thoughts on that, Michael, when you hear me say that?
I mean, we'd like to think that nobody discriminates anymore, that our rules are in place and our laws are in place that would prevent that, but it's obvious that they aren't. And it doesn't have to be a verbal discrimination, it can just be a visual discrimination because someone looks different. I mean, when I look at you, Matthew, I see a man in front of me. Now, I've also have transgender friends who do not look like the gender they want to be. And it's a visual cue. And obviously now it's a visual discrimination instead of a verbal one. So I'm sure the statistics are even higher because no one's going to admit I discriminate against because.
Or how many times maybe you lose a job and you know it's discrimination, but you can't really do anything about it or articulate it even.
Right.
What do you think though about families pushing their kids out, in particular when you hear me say that I think they mean well? Because I do. I don't think that this is necessarily an evil intention. I think it is, for me, when I hear parents like, it's a phase and they get mad at their teenager thinking, if they they're going to come back, they're going to do the right thing,
Yeah, I think, I think there are probably times when it is sort of just a way of coping for the family, but at the same time, I think that is, it's extremely harmful to somebody to be rejected to that degree. I think that has consequences that, far-reaching ripple effects. And I do think that sometimes families just don't want to deal with it. Or they can't deal with it, or there's so much of their own, for whatever reason, they feel humiliated by it, or they feel demoralized by it, and that person reminds them of that, and they distance themselves from that person and reject that person.
Right, have that tough love approach.
Yeah, or even, just, I need to get this person out of...
Right, or they're being a disgrace to the family or something,
I agree but disagree because I also think it's very self-serving on the parental unit because of fear, because of social pressure, because of lack of education. So when they're pushing their child out, I don't think it's for the child's sake. I think it's for their sake. Because out of sight, out of mind, I don't have to deal with all the stigma that goes with it. I don't have to answer the questions. Now, we like to think that everyone's a perfect parent and that they would embrace their child and want to know more about it and support them and help them transition. But obviously, that's not the case by any means.
And then this becomes such an awful cycle because if you're homeless, try getting a job. And then if you can't get a job, and then it's just spirals and spirals, and that sets you up for such violence. And also the mental health issues. And who wouldn't be depressed and then ultimately suicidal? Your family doesn't want you, society doesn't want you, you can't get a job, you have no place to live. I mean, anyone under those circumstances, no matter how hardy you are, would succumb to the ills or whatever the evils out there.
Absolutely.
And no matter what they say, we still don't have the places that people can go to be helped and to feel safe. And that's something we desperately need.
Well, and as Jeanette said, we wind up pathologizing it and making it about it being transgender when it's really about being rejected. It's about that society needs to open their hearts and minds and say, hey, I don't understand, I don't get it, who cares? You're a member of the human race.
And people get diagnosed with gender dysphoria if you land in the mental health system.
And then you have that additional stigma of mental illness.
Right. So that the dysphoria is not necessarily about a person's gender identity.
Right.
Although I guess in some situations that might be the case, at least for a brief period of time.
Sure.
But the dysphoria is about the years of being misunderstood and alienated and discriminated against and oppressed. That anybody would feel dysphoric about that.
Absolutely.
Well, and also our society doesn't realize the multitude of people that live under the LGBT umbrella. So a lot of people have the mindset of that's just a very small fraction of our population, so why are we supporting it financially, politically, and ethically? Why are we bothering? And they're not seeing and reading and hearing about the vast amount of people. I mean, the whole legalization of gay marriage and health and rights and so forth has opened that up, but again, a lot of those people are changing the channel because it doesn't affect them. They don't want to hear about it.
until it's their child or them, you know, or
Right.
their neighbor or their coworker. And the fact is, they've been working with us and living beside us and parenting, or you know, this whole time. So we just need to open up our hearts.
And that's something that I think we as, because of social media, you know, when we talk about the gay community, all we're seeing are what the press and what social media is presenting, which is usually not who we really are. You know, we're going to see all the negatives. That's what sells. So anyone who's not connected or immersed in the LGBT community sees what the press wants to put out there and what social media wants to put out there.
Sensationalized.
The sensationalized spirit of it, as opposed to the reality.
I agree. And next we are going to discuss something that is very disturbing that goes on in the LGBT community all too often. We'll be right back. In this next segment, we're going to discuss just the human experience of what it's like to be a transgender person, and to even tease out what the differences are between gender identity and sexual orientation. I get asked that all the time. What is it like for me? How did I know I was transgender? And what it feels like. I was very young. I was about 2.5, 3 years old. And what it felt like is my spirit, you know, my soul, the way I saw the world was very, very masculine, the way I was experiencing the world. And yet my body was not. My body was female. And I knew at such a young age that this wasn't right. There was something incongruent going on, and that I just didn't have the right body. And so I think of it as a sort of brain sex. My brain, my spirit was masculine, and the body was female. And so I almost see it a little bit as a birth defect. And that's why I need some of these modifications to have the body in alignment with how I see myself and how I need the world to see me. But sometimes people do confuse sexual orientation and gender identity, and they are very different things. And in my situation, I'm attracted to women, so I see myself as a heterosexual male. So let's tease that out a little bit, because we have Michael, who is a gay man, and maybe you can teach the viewers a little bit about what your experience was like.
You know, my journey was a little different. As a youth, I was questioning, so I was riding the bisexual fence, and then as I got older and in my late teens, I realized that I needed to label myself, because emotionally and psychologically I couldn't ride that fence. And I knew that in my heart of hearts I leaned more towards the homosexual side. And so that's where I went. I mean, you speak in your book about truth in identity, and that really was my truth. I mean, everyone's story is different, and some are very positive, some are not. You know, my gay side has been very fortunate, in the sense that I didn't start being discriminated against or seek any violence/abuse until I was an adult, later in life. And a lot of that came from what social media has done, and because we're talking more about it. We didn't talk about it back when I was younger. You know, it was just hidden. So now we open up ourselves, and some of the abuse, the early on abuse, was self-inflicted, because we were taught this is not normal.
Right.
So those were things I had to experience, which are much different than what our youth today has to experience and define and work with.
Right. From a human growth and development point of view, you know, me being as young as I was, is that appropriate? I mean, that's a normal growing up.
It's a very common story.
Yeah.
That people just know very early on
what their gender is.
What their gender is, and whether it aligns with their bodies. And I think that, you know, in a lot of traditional theories of human growth and development, there is a tendency to, there are assumptions of kind of binary gender identity as healthy development, and we know now that that's more fluid. And so as somebody who's been a practicing social worker for years and now teaches in social work, I you know, encourage my students who are going to be practitioners to understand that, and that when you see it, to recognize it, and to help that person to come to terms with where they're where they are, and to help that and to help families to understand, so that, you know, families are offered the tools to really help their child to grow and to flourish as a healthy individual.
And we know that when that is happening, that the outcomes are just greatly improved. I mean, the suicide goes way down.
That's right.
And thus the homelessness goes down, and the addictions go down, and all those problems.
Right.
And it's a simple thing of just being decent to each other, being positive.
And I think the stigma is that, and I'm generalizing on a whole, but people feel like, oh, you're gay as a man, so you must want to be a woman and dress like a woman, or you're a woman who's a lesbian, so you must want to be a man and dress like a man. And that's not at all the case.
Not at all, right.
You know, but again, that's what we're being force-fed from you know, the social media and what we are being shown on television and in newspapers.
Yes.
But that's not the case, and I know that's a whole future episode.
Sure.
But I think that needs to be very clear that, you know, a gay man can be the most butch-looking, sounding, acting man in the world. I wish people could come and experience an event where there are thousands of gay men and just walk around and not to put us on pedestals, but look and just go, they're just like me. They're like everybody else.
There's a variety. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
And as a gay man, I mean, you're comfortable in your own skin. You're comfortable as a man, and that's the difference. I was not comfortable in my own skin being perceived as a woman, and that's what makes me transgender.
Right.
And it makes you are attracted to other men, and that's what makes you gay man.
But that's the hard part for you and all transgender people is we're still at that. A transgender person is a drag person, someone who likes to dress up and pretend they're the opposite sex. We're still in that,
right?
You know, you know, there's still that, and you know, and we love RuPaul, and we love all those wonderful shows out there. But that's what people are seeing is that those men are dressing up to be women.
Right.
This a whole new thing about, wow, this woman wants to be a man, is reality, and it's happening, and you are a wonderful example of that.
Thank you. Do you have any final thoughts?
Well, I just want to clarify, in case anybody out there is wondering.
Absolutely.
That so there's the difference between a sexual orientation is who you're attracted to romantically, for love relationships, and a person who is transgender has a different gender identity than their assigned sex at birth.
Right.
So those are two very different things, and a person
very
who's
different
transgender
experiences
could be. I mean, you could very well be a gay man.
Absolutely. In fact, that's
but you're not. You're a heterosexual.
Right.
Man.
I happen to be heterosexual, but I know many trans men who are interested in other men.
Right.
Or trans women who are born male and transition to female, who are attracted to women or men. That's a whole different thing.
So there's sexual orientation that is the overlay on over transgender, and sexual orientation alone is a very different thing.
Yes, it is.
And we kind of lump them together. We say
do.
LGBTQ on and on, right? Plus. But LGB and T are very different.
Very. I have really thoroughly enjoyed this, and thank you both for being here today very much. And viewers, I hope that this really was educational, informative, and inspiring, and that it helps understand these larger issues that are going on in society, and it gives you the human point of view. I can't wait to further continue this series, and we will see you next time.